that it was disheartening. I think anyone in this country who has played a part in their community, who has worked in any part of government, or indeed just goes out to do a decent, honest day's work, would have been absolutely disheartened by that pathetic speech. John Key puts himself up as an aspirational leader for this country. Well, the first thing he should do is get his facts straight when trying to explain a few things to this country. Firstly, Mr. Speaker, this country does have an issue with debt, because this National Act government is borrowing $300 million every week. Mr. Speaker, the reason it's having to do that, in part, is because they have given $14 billion in tax cuts over 5 years, the vast majority of that going to 10% of the population, the wealthy 10% of this population, Mr. Speaker. That money should still be in the government coffers, and it should be spent on the things that we have seen cut in the last 2 years, Mr. Speaker. The national governments have always harmed this country, Mr. Speaker. If I go back to Mr. Muldoon, he had think big projects, Mr. Speaker, but at least left us with a legacy of some infrastructure. We had Jim Bolger, who didn't think at all. They just cut benefits and privatised anything they could. And now we've got John Key, who wants to think small. He thinks that government should be doing less, spending less, and that the private sector should be doing more. The basic flaw in that, Mr. Speaker, is that the debt problem for this country is in the hands of the private sector. And John Key will not acknowledge that, because I don't think any government is going to intervene over basic private property rights unless it feels there's a good reason to. So our ability to limit private sector debt is limited in itself. But John Key's solution to improving it is to take from the state assets, state-owned enterprises, from the state where we had a low level of debt. In fact, I can just see Michael Cullen fuming as he sits, probably not watching TV tonight, but listening to this general debate. He spent the surpluses, the additional money that we had over above government spending, back to lower debt, right down to, I think, 22% of GDP or thereabouts. One of the lowest levels of government debt in the OECD, which put this country in a very good position to take on the international financial crisis, which was where we left it when the Tories came into government, Mr. Speaker. But their flawed philosophy, which is one of doing less in government and allowing the private sector to take over, means that we will have less ability to lower the debt of this country overall. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that private sector debt was fuelled by the banks, most of them foreign-owned, Mr. Speaker, quite happy to take the profits when things were doing well, but now showing signs of a little bit of caution and indeed a bit of fear in their inability and their reluctance to fund capital, particularly in the primary sector, Mr. Speaker. I think we're in a shocking situation, and this government has shown absolutely no plan as to what it's going to do to get us out of that, Mr. Speaker. It has cut $14 billion from the government spend and handed that back to about the top 10% of the country, Mr. Speaker. It's increased GST, increased the cost to each and every New Zealander across this economy. And now we are starting to really feel that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Key, as the so-called aspirational leader for this country, aspired to take us along the path of Ireland. In fact, in 2008, he was still championing the wonderful benefits of Ireland as an economy. The trappings, I think he says, the trappings of a considerable economic success story is what he said. Well, it shows, and it is a measure of his poor judgment, Mr. Speaker, that just over 2 years ago he was claiming Ireland as an amazing success story. Mr. Speaker, the thing that I agreed with Mr. Key on, but I can't quite reconcile with what his policies are, is that he said, quote, we need to own more of our own future. And he then set about to justify why we need to sell off our state-owned enterprises, Mr. Speaker. What a bizarre situation and contradiction to indeed put before this country. I don't think New Zealanders are conned in any way at all, Mr Speaker. I don't think they're fooled for one moment that the so-called 49% threshold and the so-called preferential allocation to Kiwi mums and dads, and in fact I've been challenged, Mr Speaker, to not use that term because, as we know, it won't be that. It will be to give preferential rights to the wealthy people who can afford to buy shares and who will then on-sell them to foreign investors, Mr Speaker. The New Zealanders I have spoken to up and down this country are not fooled for one moment that what that means is effective privatisation and sell-off into private hands of our state-owned enterprises, Mr Speaker, starting with the electricity sector, Mr Speaker, noting solid energy. And I say to you, and I've been too scared to say it, Mr Speaker, is that Landcorp will be next, of course. Because David Carter said a number of times that he doesn't think government should be in the business of farming, Mr Speaker. That means Landcorp will be on the blocks as well. So the question is, where does that leave us as a country? Because if the private sector is all too keen, too often, to sell shares to foreigners, Mr Speaker, because there's a nice handsome profit in it, because they might see a windfall gain somewhere, well, where does that lead us down the path? It certainly does not take us to John Key's statement of owning our own future, Mr Speaker. Indeed, we are heading in the wrong direction. John Key, David Carter and a few of them, although David Carter less so, of course, made statements against the sale of Crayford farms to the Chinese. Oh, I think we should be very concerned about that. In fact, I think there are some other statements that John Key didn't want us to become workers in our own land, Mr Speaker, or the other words I think he said he wouldn't want to see wholesale sale of New Zealand's land productive sector. Well, I agree with him, Mr Speaker, but what's he done about it? Zippo, nothing. Because what happened after his statement of March the 7th, 2010, Mr Speaker, raising concerns about the sale of the Crayford farms, indeed this year, 1st of February, we see that, in fact, the Germans have paid $109 million for 10 farms down in Southland, Mr Speaker. And what did he say about that? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Well, if he is passionate about land, then perhaps he should stand up, be true to his principles and be consistent for a change. But not only in the sale of land that Labor has indicated we will move on to restrict, we do want to indeed have some control over our future, Mr Speaker, but the National Party has refused to move in that area. In fact, it's refusing to move in the other area of PG Wrightson's potential sale as well. And I'm not sure, I haven't heard a squeak from the national government whether it thinks that the purchase by Agria, an Asian company of PG Wrightson's, the #1 agricultural service company in this country, whether that is a good or bad thing, Mr Speaker. Or maybe it should be taken over by Agrium, another foreign-owned company. Mr Speaker, it goes on and on and on. And the problem is that the National Party sitting over there, Mr Speaker, think that the private sector will deliver a wonderful future for this country. Well, we have to acknowledge their wonderful efforts, Mr Speaker, but government has to ensure that core infrastructure so that we can pay for early childhood education, adult and community education, for that minister's treaty settlements, if you'll ever get one of them, Mr Speaker, one that hasn't been negotiated by the previous Labor government. Oh, we'll wait and see how you perform tomorrow with your legislation, Minister, over there. We'll see how well you go negotiating with your coalition partners. Good luck to you. We'll be pointing out a few double standards, I guess, that the National Party has taken over the issue of seabed and foreshore. That minister should be very, very quiet. In fact, there's an H word that was a wonderful description of his position on many, many issues. Mr Speaker, the national government has to stand up, provide some plan and some real aspiration and some true control on our economy. Otherwise, Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister's so-called claims that we need to own our own future will in fact be a fallacy, along with most of the other policies and claims that the national government has made while it's been in power.